Thousands of brave souls lost their lives in the fighting pits of Europe and beyond. But have you ever considered what happened to the bodies of these men after the fighting was done and the crowds had dispersed? Were they given the respect and funerals they so deserved, or were they simply treated the same as they had been in life and insulted one final time? Today, we're going to take a look at gladiator culture and what happened to the bodies of those brave men once they were done fighting. Stay with us. We look into the fate of the fearless warriors who fought across the Roman Empire in venues such as the iconic Colosseum in Rome. It would help if we actually knew a little bit about why these people were actually forced to fight in the first place. As with most historical events of note, gladiatorial combat is often a rabbit hole of curiosity where modern minds are concerned. One of the most distinctive and bloody aspects of Roman culture, the practice first emerged somewhere between the 4th and 3rd century BCE. Given the fact that no one is around from those heady days, it is virtually impossible for us to truly understand how or why the practice ever came about. I guess we can chalk that one down to man's insatiable appetite for blood. Some historians believe that gladiatorial combat actually evolved from the Etruscan people, who preceded the Romans, with the Romans then modifying it and incorporating it into their own culture. The Etruscans are said to have mostly used the practice during funeral rites, which is how it all began for the Romans. But slowly, it crept into more and more facets of the culture until it was being used as something of a public spectacle for little more than simple entertainment. I mean, before we rush into judgment, society was yet to evolve to anywhere near what we are used to these days, and there was little else to do back then. So could we possibly understand their motives? If you have seen the Hollywood movie, you will almost certainly know that gladiators, for the most part, were either slaves, criminals, or condemned men. On the very rare occasion, you might come across a man who took part simply for the adrenaline rush, but these sorts of men were very few and far between. They would also very likely have been the sort of person you would want to have given a very wide berth to, and probably saw gladiatorial combat as a way to attain fame and fortune. Although they had been around since the 4th or 3rd century BC, gladiator games didn't become popular until around 100 BC. There wasn't just one type of gladiator either. Depending on your skill set, you might arm yourself with a curved sword and a small square shield, which would make you a trunks. There were also the rotarius, whose weapon of choice would be the net and trident, or the mormillo, who favored a short sword and a larger shield. As we know, this wasn't just a hobby for these men, it was their life. They spent the majority of their time outside the fighting pits and training schools, where they were taught combat techniques and skills that would ultimately, for many, save their lives. Others weren't so lucky. When it was time to put their skills to use, gladiators would often be forced to reenact famous battles or be used as prey for large animals. Amazingly, the crowd lapped this up, with emperors using these games as popularity tools. Thankfully for the condemned, the practice was officially outlawed by Western Roman Emperor Honorius somewhere around 400 AD, although the exact date is up for discussion. However, it had actually stopped some 75 years before this, as Constantine the Great banned it, but never officially outlawed it. Of course, the gladiatorial age had a huge cultural impact, and is never very far from anyone's lips whenever the Roman Empire is discussed. So, what actually happened to these men if they were unlucky enough to be slain during battle? Well, the answer to that question would basically depend on your station in life before death. Many of these gladiators were simply reduced to a disappearing footprint in the sands of memory. As I said, the vast majority of these men would have been slaves in life, so you can bet your bottom dollar that they wouldn't have been treated with any sort of dignity in death either. The majority of the time, the bodies of the gladiators would have been left on display where they took their last breath, as a macabre reminder to the masses of spectators of just what could happen if you choose the wrong path in life. After a sustained period on the arena floor, their bodies would simply have been removed and dumped in a communal pit, reminding us of the sheer brutality of the time. On other occasions, bodies might have been cremated, but the one overarching theme of these events is that there would never have been any sort of period of mourning or any sort of fuss made of the dead. Another thing we know about the period is that there was very little in the way of morals or ethics. I mean, we're talking about a time when people actively paid to see men butcher each other. There were plenty of occasions when these gladiators were forced to go up against dangerous wild animals who didn't exactly take kindly to being caged up. As you can imagine, man stands very little chance against a lion or bear, so more often than not, the gladiators would be mauled to death. Instead of buying meat to feed these beasts, the authorities would simply feed the fallen gladiators to their animals. This served the purpose of killing two birds with one stone. Not only were they able to feed the animals for free, they were also providing extra entertainment for the paying crowd, who would be more likely to come back next time if they knew they were getting more bang for their buck, to put it crudely. Now, these options would have been the fate for the majority of men who entered gladiatorial combat. But there were a couple of other options, believe it or not. Gladiators who had proven their mettle over the years, or had been popular with the crowds, and garnered a little bit of fame, might have been given a more elaborate end. This also applied to wealthy gladiators. These men could expect a respectful burial service, but this was somewhat rare. Of course, there were also cases in which some gladiators simply refused to die. If they had been wounded, but not killed, and the gladiatorial combat event had concluded, they would simply be dragged out of the arena and possibly given medical attention, although I'm not too sure how good a hospital in the bowels of the Colosseum would have been. If a gladiator had won his battle and wasn't seriously injured, he was often at the whims of the emperor, or if he found himself fighting on the regional circuit, the event organizer would determine his fate. As in the movie, his popularity would often come into play, and if he was a showman or a crowd favorite, he would more than likely be given a pass. A lot of the time, however, these men would have simply been put to the sword as just another part of the show. One of the more intriguing aspects of gladiator culture was that it was actually possible to win your freedom, although it definitely wasn't the easiest thing to do. Most gladiators were owned by some wealthy individual or another, who would sometimes make a deal with their man, win a certain amount of games, and line their pockets enough, and they would be given freedom. They would then go through a ceremony known as missio, in which they were provided with a wooden training sword, which supposedly symbolized their freedom. The gladiator would then be free to follow any career paths he chose. Oftentimes, they would return home, or simply pursue another career. But on the odd occasion, some of these men actually chose to continue life as a gladiator. I guess you just can't replace that feeling of adrenaline. Thankfully, the barbaric practice of gladiatorial combat is one which has long been consigned to the past, where it well and truly belongs. Whilst it has no place in today's modern world, it is important to remember the practice in order not to repeat it. As the old saying goes, this was a true survival of the fittest situation, one which only the strongest and bravest could truly prosper. This has been Nasty History, and I will see you again next time.